My name is Arthur Bellamy. I am 70 years old, and I live alone in a two-story house on Fenwick Road in Caldwell, Vermont. It is a good house, the kind that was built to last and has kept its promise. 4 bedrooms, a back garden that Margaret spent 20 years making into something worth looking at, a kitchen with south-facing windows that fill with light every morning, whether or not there is anyone awake to see it. I have lived here for 31 years. For the last 4, I have lived here alone. People in Caldwell are kind. They bring food when you lose someone. They ask how you are holding up, and they mean it, at least for the first year. After that, they assume you have found your footing, which is a reasonable assumption. I had found my footing. I got up every morning. I kept the house in order. I attended to my finances and my health and my one surviving friendship with a man named George, who came for dinner every other Thursday and never asked how I was doing in the particular way that means they want you to say fine. George wanted to know. I told him the truth. That is what good friends do. What I did not do was ask anything of life beyond what it was already offering. Margaret had died 4 years before that October. Heart failure on a Tuesday afternoon, no warning, while she was in the garden, which was typical of her. She had strong opinions about not making a fuss. We had been married 38 years. After she was gone, I came to believe, without ever quite saying it to myself directly, that what had been was what there was, that the account was closed. I was 70 years old, and I had had a good marriage, and I did not expect to have another, and I had made a kind of peace with that, the particular peace that looks like wisdom and is mostly just stillness. I was the most careful man Margaret had ever met. She said so often, and not always as a compliment. That was the condition I was in on the 14th of October, when I drove 40 minutes to Heron Falls to attend the funeral of Harold Whitfield. Harold had been my accountant for 22 years. He was not a close friend. We were not the kind of men who had close friends in that easy, declared way. But he was a good man who had done right by me for 2 decades. And when his obituary appeared in the paper, I felt the particular heaviness that comes when someone who has been a reliable presence in your life is suddenly, quietly, gone. I put on my good suit. I drove the 40 minutes. I came in from the side entrance because the main doors were blocked by a crowd I didn't recognize, and I moved into the third pew from the front on the left side, which seemed appropriate for a man of my particular relationship to the deceased. I did not notice the woman sitting at the other end of the pew. That is not entirely true. I noticed her the way you notice furniture, registered that someone was there, a dark coat, gray hair, a stillness that I took for grief. I set my hat on my knee and looked forward and waited for the service to begin. The organ started. People settled. And then, from the far end of the bench, so quietly I almost thought I had imagined it, came 2 words. Please stay. I turned. She was looking directly at me. 68, perhaps 69. A face that was still striking in the way faces are when the bones underneath have always been good. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, gray eyes that were red-rimmed but clear. She wore a dark blue coat, not black, and her hands were folded in her lap with the deliberate composure of someone who has been holding herself together all morning and is no longer entirely certain she will make it to the end. I said, very quietly, I beg your pardon, she said. I know you don't know me, but Harold's family is in the front pew and his colleagues are filling in behind them, and I have been sitting here for 20 minutes, and every person who comes in takes one look and moves to another row. She paused. She was not asking for pity. She was asking for something practical. I just need someone beside me who isn't going to leave before the service ends. I looked at her. Then I looked at the pew around us. There was, I now realized, a deliberate gap between where she sat and where the rest of the congregation had settled. The kind of gap that forms around people at funerals when no one is sure who they are or how close to them one is permitted to sit. I said, I'm not going anywhere. She nodded once, very slightly, and turned back to face the front. She did not say thank you, which I respected more than if she had. My name is Arthur Bellamy, I said quietly, not because I thought she needed to know it right then, but because it seemed like the decent thing to give her. She said, without turning her head, Miriam Whitfield. It took me a moment. Then the shape of everything assembled itself with the particular clarity of something obvious that you have simply failed to see. Whitfield. The front pew, which I could now see clearly from the third row, contained Harold's adult children. I had met them once, years ago, at a Christmas party, and conspicuously, an empty seat at the end, closest to the aisle. Miriam Whitfield was Harold's wife, and she was sitting in the third pew instead of the first, because someone, or several someones, had made the first pew unavailable to her. I did not ask. It was not the time to ask. It was the time to sit still and be, as she had requested, someone who did not leave before the service ended. I stayed for the entire service. I sat with my hat on my knee and listened to Harold's eldest son deliver a eulogy that was full of warmth and remembered him generously and never once mentioned Miriam. I watched the front pew from my position behind it and observed, with the careful attention of a man who has learned to read rooms, the particular geometry of a family at a funeral, who touched whom, who leaned toward whom, who was and who was not included in the small automatic gestures of shared grief. Miriam sat beside me for the full hour. She did not cry, or rather she cried in the controlled way of someone who has decided exactly how much grief they are willing to display in public. Once, near the end of the service, her hands tightened in her lap, a white-knuckled moment, brief, and I moved my own hand and rested it on the pew between us, not touching hers, just close enough that she could feel the presence of another person. She did not reach for it, but her hands loosened. I noticed the way she held herself, straight-backed, chin level, the posture of someone who had decided before she arrived that she would not give anyone the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. The way she looked at the back of Harold's children's heads with an expression that was not anger and not love, but something in between, the specific emotion of someone who has spent years in the territory between two things without ever being allowed to land on either side. I thought about Margaret, about the front pew I had sat in at her funeral, the way people had pressed in around me, the way the grief had been visible and nameable and socially legible. I had not understood, until that afternoon, that this was a kind of privilege, that some grief has no pew assigned to it, that some grief has to find its own place in the back of the room and sit quietly and not make anyone uncomfortable. When the final hymn ended and the congregation began to file out, Miriam did not move. She sat very still while the church emptied around her, and I sat with her. When the church was nearly empty, she said, without looking at me, "You didn't have to stay for all of it." I said, "I told you I wasn't going anywhere." She looked at me then. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite gratitude, something more complicated and more honest. She said, "You didn't know what you were agreeing to." I said, "That's generally true of the things worth agreeing to." She studied me for a moment with the directness of a woman who has decided that life is too short for anything other than looking at things straight on. Afterward, the congregation filed toward the reception hall. Miriam stood and straightened her coat, and for a moment she looked, very plainly, like someone deciding whether to go into a room she had not been invited into. She looked at me. I looked at her. I said, "Is there somewhere else I can take you?" She said, "There's a diner 2 streets over. I went there with Harold every Sunday for 11 years. They know me there." I said, "Then let's go there." We walked. The October afternoon was cool and clear, the leaves at their peak on the maples lining the street. Miriam walked with a straight back and a measured pace, and she did not speak until we were inside and seated in a corner booth, and a woman of about 50 with a kind, alert face came over and said, "Miriam, honey," I heard, "I'm so sorry," then looked at me with a question in her eyes. Miriam said, "This is Arthur. He sat with me." The woman Donna, who owned the place with her husband, squeezed Miriam's hand and brought coffee within minutes, which is what you do for someone who needs it now. We sat across from each other. The afternoon light came through the window and lay across the table between us. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup and waited, because some silences are not meant to be filled, and a person learns, at 70, which ones those are. After a while, Miriam said, "Harold and I were together for 9 years. We weren't married. He was going to leave his wife, and then she became ill. And then she recovered, and then he was going to leave again, and then something else, and then something else again." She said this without bitterness, or with bitterness so long processed it had become simply the shape of the story. He died before he got around to it. So his family, who knew about me and made their feelings clear some years ago, had the funeral, and I was welcome to attend, which I took to mean I was welcome to sit where no one would have to acknowledge me. I said, "I'm sorry." She looked at me. She said, "Are you sorry because you think I made a mistake? Or sorry because it ended this way?" I said, "Sorry because no one should have to sit alone in a pew at the funeral of someone they loved for 9 years." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked out the window. She said, "Margaret is your wife?" I said, "Was. She died 4 years ago." Miriam said, "How long were you married?" I said, 38 years. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 38 years and you still come to your accountant's funeral. That's a decent man." I said I wasn't sure decency had much to do with it. Harold had done right by me for a long time. "It seemed like the right thing to do," she said. "Most people don't think about what's the right thing to do anymore. They think about what's the comfortable thing." We talked for 2 hours. Donna came back twice with coffee without being asked, which is the mark of someone paying attention. Miriam told me about Harold as she had known him, funny in a dry, understated way, terrible at remembering birthdays, but remarkable at remembering small things. She had said months before, the kind of man who read actual books with actual opinions about them, who had cried once at a film and been embarrassed about it for years. I told her about Margaret, about the 38 years, about the specific silence of a house after someone has been in it for that long, how the silence is not uniform, how it has different textures in different rooms, how the kitchen is the loudest kind of quiet and the bedroom a heavier one, more like weight than sound. Miriam listened with the full attention of someone who recognizes a landscape they have walked through themselves. She said, "For me it was the Sunday mornings. Harold and I had Sunday mornings. When that was gone, the weeks lost their shape. They all felt the same length, which sounds neutral, but isn't. It's a kind of vertigo." I said, "I know that vertigo," she said. 4 years is a long time to be vertiginous. I said, "You accommodate it. You learn to stand up straight even when the floor isn't cooperating." She said, "Harold never learned that. He needed the floor to cooperate." I said, "Most of us do." She said, "You seem like you've managed." I said, "I've managed to stay upright." "I'm not sure that's the same thing." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "No, I don't suppose it is." Miriam said, "Grief is different when no one officially recognizes it. When you lose a husband or a wife, people know what to do. There are casseroles. There's a word for what you are. When you lose someone you loved for 9 years but weren't married to, you're just a woman sitting in the wrong pew." I said, "For what it's worth, I don't think it was the wrong pew." She looked at me. I said, "I think you sat exactly where you should have. I just should have been there sooner." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "That might be the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a long time." I said I meant it. Outside, the October afternoon was fading toward evening. The maple leaves were gold against the pale sky. When we finally left the diner, Donna hugged Miriam at the door and said, "Come back Sunday, same as always." And Miriam said, "Maybe." And Donna said, "I mean it." And Miriam said, "I know you do." On the sidewalk, I said, "Can I drive you somewhere?" Miriam said, "I have my car." She looked at me with the particular look of someone deciding something quickly and honestly. She said, "Do you come to Heron Falls often?" I said, "Not often." "I'm in Caldwell, about 40 minutes." She said, Harold always said. Caldwell had a good hardware store. I said it did. I had been going to the same one for 30 years. She said, Harold could never find a decent hardware store here. He was always complaining about it. I said, if he had asked, I would have told him where to go. Something moved across her face then. The specific expression that comes when something funny and something painful arrive at exactly the same moment. She pressed her lips together. Then she said, he was like that, never asking for directions. I said, most of us are. She said, you came to his funeral, and you didn't even know where to sit. I said, I knew where I meant to sit. I just sat in the wrong pew by accident. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she said, maybe it wasn't the wrong pew after all. She gave me her telephone number, written on the back of one of Donna's business cards. She said, if you're ever in Heron Falls for hardware reasons or otherwise, coffee is on me. I drove home in the October dark, thinking about the specific accident of sitting down in the wrong place and finding that the wrong place was, in some way that had nothing to do with the seating chart. Exactly right. I called her on a Thursday, 10 days later. Not for hardware reasons. I said so directly. Because at 70, I have found that indirection costs more than it saves. I said, I've been thinking about our conversation at the diner, and I wondered if you might like to have dinner. There was a pause. Not a long one. Then she said, I'd like that. Those 10 days were quieter than any I had spent in a long time, but quiet in a different way than I had grown used to. More like a weather change than the usual stillness. A gradual shift in pressure, the sense that something that had been still was beginning, very slightly, to move again. I put on a record one evening, something Margaret had always liked that I had not listened to in 4 years, and I sat in the living room and listened to it all the way through without getting up halfway to turn it off. These are small things. But small things are how you know. We had dinner at a restaurant in Heron Falls that she chose, not the diner. Somewhere quieter, a place with good lighting and cloth napkins. She was already there when I arrived, which I would come to understand was characteristic. Miriam was not a woman who kept people waiting, because she had spent enough years waiting herself to consider it a form of small cruelty. She told me about her work. She had been a landscape architect for 30 years before retiring, which explained, she said, why she could not look at anyone's garden without an opinion forming immediately and unbidden. I said that sounded like my wife with houses. She could tell the entire history of a family by the way they had organized their living room. Miriam said, I do that with gardens. Soil doesn't lie. You can see exactly what a person values and what they've neglected. I said, what do you see in a garden that's been neglected for 4 years? She looked at me. She said, someone who has been spending their energy somewhere else. I said, would you like to see it? She said, are you asking me to come to Caldwell? I said I was. She said, that's a significant thing to ask, Arthur. I said I knew it was. I also said I was 70 years old and had found in the last 4 years that being careful about significant things mostly meant being alone. She looked at me for a long time across the cloth napkins and the good lighting. Then she said, show me the garden. We'll see what it needs. She came the following Saturday. She stood at the edge of the back garden for a long time without speaking, which I recognized as professional assessment rather than politeness. Then she walked the bed slowly, crouching occasionally, pulling up a handful of soil and rubbing it between her fingers, looking at the light from every angle. After about 20 minutes, she stood up and said, this has very good bones. Whoever planted it knew what they were doing. I said Margaret had planned every inch of it. Miriam said, she had good instincts. The structure is still here. It just needs someone to pay attention to it again. I said, that's what I thought. I just didn't know how to start. She looked at me in a way that I understood was not only about the garden. She said, you start by showing up. The rest follows. We spent the afternoon in the garden. By late afternoon, it looked like something that had been remembered rather than abandoned. Miriam stood back and looked at it in the low October light and said, Margaret had an eye for this. I said, she had an eye for most things. Miriam said, so did Harold. He just didn't always act on it in time. I said, that's the thing about time. It feels abundant until it isn't. She looked at me. She said, is that what you thought when you sat down in that pew? I said, I wasn't thinking anything. I just sat down. But afterward, yes. Afterward, I thought that the most important things in my life have mostly happened by accident, that I have spent a great deal of time being careful, and that careful has its place, but it cannot be the whole of it. She said, Harold was careful too, for 9 years. I said, I know. She said, I'm not going to do that again. I said, I'm not asking you to. She looked at me for a long moment. The October light was very low, golden, coming across the garden at an angle that made everything look the way things look when you are paying close attention to them. She said, what are you asking? I said, I'm asking for Sunday dinners. I'm asking to see the garden in spring. I'm asking to sit in the right pew this time, with your knowledge and your permission, and not to be in any hurry about what comes after. Miriam was quiet. She looked at the garden. Then she looked at me. She said, Sunday dinners I can do. I said, then that's where we start. She came the following Sunday. She brought wine, which she said Harold had always failed to do when someone cooked for him. And she had decided early on not to repeat his mistakes. I made a pot roast, which was the one thing I had always been able to make reliably, and we ate at the kitchen table with the garden visible through the window, and talked until the light was completely gone. My son Daniel called the following week. He lived in Toronto, a city that had been eating distance between us for 15 years, though we spoke reliably on Sunday evenings. He was 51 years old, a civil engineer, careful and precise in the way that suggests he absorbed it from his parents and never had reason to unlearn it. He asked how I was. I said, "Better than I've been," he said. "What does that mean?" I told him about the funeral, the pew, the diner, Miriam. I told it plainly, because at 70 plain speech is one of the few genuine luxuries available. Daniel was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Dad, how long has this been?" I said, 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, I said. I'm 70 years old, Daniel. 3 weeks is not nothing, he said. I want you to be careful. I said, I have been careful for 70 years. Some of it has been very useful. Some of it has just been a way of standing still and calling it wisdom. He said, I don't want you to get hurt. I said, Daniel, your mother has been dead for 4 years. The hurt is already there. The question is what you do with the space around it. He went quiet again. I could hear him thinking, which is something he has done audibly since he was a child. Then he said, Is she good to you? I said, She's honest. She doesn't waste time. She has opinions about gardens. He said, Mom had opinions about gardens. I said, yes. Different opinions, but the same energy. He said, okay. Then he said, bring her to Christmas. I said it was only October. He said, I know. Bring her to Christmas anyway. She came the Sunday after that, and the one after that. By December, she knew where I kept the good dish towels. By January, she had opinions about my bookshelves. She said the organization was illogical, and she was right. I had arranged them by when I had read them, rather than by any system a second person could navigate, which she said was a very telling choice, and I said it hadn't needed to be navigable by a second person for 4 years. And she said, well, it does now, and something in how she said it made the kitchen feel like a different room. In February, she told me that the bed in the guest room had a spring that needed attention, which meant she had been staying long enough to notice it. I fixed the spring. We had an argument in February that I want to tell you about, because a life told without its arguments is not an honest account. It was about Harold, the 9 years, and what they meant and how they lived in her. And it started because I said something clumsy about the nature of long commitments, and she heard in it a judgment I had not intended. And she said so directly, which is the only way Miriam ever said anything. I sat with that for a moment, and then I said, You're right, that was a clumsy thing to say. And she said, yes, it was. And we sat in silence for a while, the particular silence of two people who have said something true to each other and are waiting for the air to settle. After a while, she said, Harold gave me 9 years of a half-life. I'm not interested in another half-life. If that's what this is going to be, I need to know now. I said, Miriam, look at me. She looked at me. I said, I sat in the wrong pew at a funeral, and you asked me not to leave, and I didn't leave. I have driven 40 minutes to Heron Falls every week for 3 months. I have let you reorganize my bookshelves. I am not offering you a half-life. I don't know exactly what I'm offering yet, because we're still in the early part of the story. But whatever it is, it's the whole of it, not the part that's convenient. The whole. She was very still. Then she said, the bookshelves were genuinely illogical. I said, I know, she said. I'm keeping the new system. I said, I expected nothing less. She looked at me for a long moment. Then something in her face changed. Not the compressed smile I had seen at the funeral, but something fuller, something that had decided to arrive with its whole self. She said, You're a very careful man, Arthur Bellamy. I said, I'm trying to be less so. She said, Don't try too hard. The careful part is useful. You just needed to know when to sit down. In March, she brought seedlings she had started from cuttings, plants from her own garden that would do well in mine. We spent a Saturday afternoon planting them in the beds she had helped me restore in October. She was specific about placement, and I did what she said, and occasionally offered a counter-argument which she considered with genuine seriousness before either agreeing or explaining, in precise terms, why I was wrong. Daniel and his wife came for a weekend in March. I introduced Miriam at the door, and my daughter-in-law, Catherine, who is the kind of person who decides things quickly and lives comfortably with her decisions, shook Miriam's hand and said, "Arthur talks about your garden plans. I want to hear all of it." Daniel shook Miriam's hand and looked at her, and then looked at me and gave a single small nod, the kind of nod that carries more than a paragraph could. At dinner, Miriam and Daniel discovered a shared interest in the structural engineering of bridges, which left Catherine and me to our own conversation. Catherine said quietly, "She's good, Arthur." I said, "I knew." She said, "No, I mean she's really good. The kind of good that takes years to recognize." I said, "I sat next to her by accident." She said, "I don't think there's such a thing." At the end of the afternoon, standing at the edge of the garden in the March light, Miriam said, "Margaret would have liked these." I said, "She would have had opinions about them." Miriam said, "So do I." I said, "Yes. That's why I planted them where you said." She looked at me. Then she smiled. Not the careful, compressed smile I had seen at the funeral, but something fuller, arriving with its whole self. She said, "You're learning." I said, "I'm trying." She said, "Arthur, you sat down in the right pew. You just didn't know it yet." I looked at the garden, Margaret's bones, Miriam's eye, a March afternoon with both of them present in their different ways. I said, "I think you're right." She said, "I usually am." I said, "I know. I've noticed." She laughed. And the garden, which had been so long without anyone paying it the right kind of attention, received that sound the way gardens receive things, when the conditions are finally right, quietly, and with no fuss, as though it had been waiting for exactly this. In April, on a Sunday, we went back to the diner. Donna was behind the counter when we came in, and she looked at us, at Miriam, and then at me, and then at the particular way we were standing, close but not quite touching, the way two people stand when they have become comfortable with each other in a way that no longer requires management, and she said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Corner booth?" Miriam said, "Please." Donna brought coffee before we asked, 2 cups, without being told, and I saw her say something to her husband, who looked over once and nodded. Miriam wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. She looked around the diner, at the corner where she and Harold had sat every Sunday for 11 years, at the window where the April light was coming in pale and clean. She said, "I wasn't sure I was going to be able to come back here." I said, "And?" She said, "It's different than I thought. Not worse, just different." I said, "Most things are," she said. "Harold's chair faces that way. I always sat with my back to the window so he could see the street. He liked to watch the street." I said, "Do you want to sit that way now?" She thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "No, I'd rather see the room." I said, "Then we'll sit exactly where we are." She looked at me. The morning light was on her face, the particular April light that is both soft and very clear, the kind that shows you things as they actually are, rather than as you would like them to be. She said, "Arthur." I said, "Yes." She said, "You're going to have to stop being surprised every time I say something you weren't expecting." I said, "I'll do my best." She said, "I'm serious. I can see you recalibrating. Every time." I said, "I spent 38 years with a woman who said exactly what she meant. I know the look. I'm just not used to it coming from someone new." Miriam was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is that what I am? Someone new?" I said, "You're someone I sat next to by accident, who turned out to be the least accidental thing that's happened to me in years." She didn't answer right away. She looked out the window, at the April street, at the trees beginning their slow return to green. When she looked back at me, her expression had settled into something I recognized, the look of someone who has decided to stop being careful about a thing, and is for the first time in a long time comfortable with that decision. She said, "Same time next Sunday?" I said, "I'll be here." She said, "Bring something to argue about." "I find it keeps the coffee from going cold." I said, "I'll see what I can manage." She smiled, the full one, the one that had decided to arrive with its whole self. "I am 70 years old. I sat in the wrong pew at a funeral by accident, and a woman I had never met asked me not to leave, and I did not leave. And from that single unhurried act of staying put came everything I have just told you. I do not know what the next years look like in every particular. I know there are Sunday dinners and a garden and bookshelves that now make a kind of logical sense, and an argument every few weeks that we both recover from with increasing ease. I know that grief does not disappear. It simply gets company. Miriam's grief and my grief sit in the same room now, and they have learned, the way long-kept things sometimes do, to take up less space than they used to. Not because they have diminished, but because the room has gotten larger. I know that at 70, you do not have the same relationship to time that you had at 25 or 40 or even 60. You know in a way that is not morbid, but simply accurate, that the supply is finite and the expenditure should be chosen accordingly. Margaret taught me most of what I know about love, and one of the things she taught me, without ever saying it in words, was that love is not a thing you receive complete and finished. It is a thing you build, over time, with the specific material of two particular people's lives, their habits, and their opinions, and their silences, and their laughter, and it requires, above all, the willingness to sit still and let it accumulate. I sat in the wrong pew. I stayed. And in staying, I sat in the right one after all. That is, at 70, the most honest thing I can tell you. The rest is Sunday mornings and a garden in spring, and a woman who reorganizes your bookshelves without asking permission and is right about it, which is, as it turns out, more than enough.